Welcome to the Skeptical panel, Pre-bunking Fake News in an Election Year. I'm Eugenie Scott. Skeptics have always been concerned with dis and misinformation, especially regarding science. It's part of our concern about the public understanding of science, as well as our commitment to critical thinking. There's something about mis and disinformation that annoys us as skeptics. But more than that, as citizens, we're especially concerned when misinformation about vaccines, or climate change, and energy issues, other science-related subjects is found among or spread by decision makers in society, such as elected officials. Such information affects all of us, not just us skeptics with our fussy sensibilities about facts and opinions. So we decided that a good topic for the 2024 Skeptical would be to get together a group of experts on misinformation to talk about how misinformation can affect the upcoming election and what might be done about it. But please note that 2024 is an election year not only in the United States, but around the world. Wikipedia notes that at least 97 countries are holding elections in 2024, including some of the largest. The US, Russia, Brazil, Mexico, Pakistan, India, the European Union, and recently announced the United Kingdom. Estimates are that approximately 1/2 the world's population will vote in 2024. Now, it's no surprise that elections are opportunities for mis and disinformation, as entities vie to promote their candidates and views. Misinformation has always been rife at election time. But modern communications have increased the opportunity for both intentional and inadvertent miscommunication. It's a serious issue because in a democracy, citizens make decisions about leadership and other societal issues. When citizens are misinformed or disinformed, the decisions made aren't going to be optimal. Furthermore, democracies can operate only when there is general acceptance that procedures and institutions are fair and honest. Mis and disinformation undermine both the quality of decisions we make and the trust in institutions that democratic countries require to function successfully. Tackling the nature of misinformation and how best to correct extant misinformation and reduce its future spread is thus well worth examining. The panel consists of researchers who have considerable insight into these topics. In addition, all of them have considerable experience communicating their work to the public. Let me briefly introduce the panelists, and you will learn more about their interests and accomplishment as the hour continues. Darren Linvill is a professor in the Communications Department at Clemson University and co-director of the Media Forensics Hub. He has extensively researched the strategy and tactics of how foreign influence operations use social media with a focus on China and Russia. He also helped develop the online game The Troll Quiz, wherein users attempt to distinguish between messages sent by either trolls or legitimate communicators. And I just want to mention that he and his colleagues downloaded 3 million Russian tweets before the 2020 election. That is a statistic that just sticks in my mind for maybe obvious reasons. Sander van der Linden is a social psychologist and director of the Social Decision-Making Laboratory at the University of Cambridge, who researches how to combat the spread of misinformation. He is especially known for his work on inoculation theory and gamification. Among his many publications is his book, Foolproof: Why We Fall for Misinformation and How to Build Immunity, which has been described as an epidemiological approach to studying and countering the spread of misinformation. Mekela Panditharatne is a lawyer at the Brennan Center for Justice, a nonprofit law and public policy institute associated with the New York University Law School. She works in the Election Misinformation Project and specializes in the role of artificial information in the spread of mis and disinformation. Welcome, all of you, to Skeptical. I'm first going to start with having panelists talk about what's going on in the world of mis and disinformation and fake news, and then move to what we can do about it. So, my friends, what sort of shenanigans have we seen during past elections that we might anticipate seeing in the upcoming one? In previous elections, we saw evidence of attempted interference by Russia and China. So, Darren, this is your area of specialty, although obviously Mekela and Sander may wish to contribute to this conversation as well. But just for a starter, What were their goals? What were their methods? How successful were they? Tell us a little bit about the Russian and Chinese previous attempts and maybe what they're doing today.
So the work that Russia and China do tends to look very different from one another. So I want to start, I think, by talking about Russia, because I think they're probably a little bit more well-known, especially what they have done in 2016 and 2020, and then I'll touch on what we're seeing from them today and what we're likely to see from them in 2024. So I think it's fairly well known that in 2016 and through 2020, they were trying to divide America. They were targeting very specific communities online with disinformation and trying to make the opinions and views of those communities more extreme than they would have been otherwise. They attacked any moderate political candidates and focused on pulling Americans and the West more broadly farther apart from one another, making it more difficult to govern. And it's worth saying they certainly also supported the candidacy of Donald Trump both in 2016 and 2020. One of the main ways that they did that in both those campaigns was by creating sort of artisanal troll accounts across a variety of platforms, but especially Facebook and Twitter. And what they would do is they would create accounts that would pretend to be a participant in a particular community. This might be anything from an account that took on the persona of a MAGA American to someone using what's called digital blackface, pretending to be a Black American and engaging in conversations about Black Lives Matter, or even a Latino American or someone engaging in conversations as part of the LGBTQ community. And they would and they would take on those persona, build up a following over time, often using legitimate information and honest conversation, and often talking about things we needed to be talking about. But they would build up a following over time and then use that following to inject mis and disinformation into the conversation. What we're seeing moving forward, I think, looks very different than what we saw in 2016 and 2020. What they did in the past took an investment. To build up an account takes a lot of time. It takes resources. It takes, an actual human typing at their computer for hours a day to build up that following over time. And with more people looking for what the Russians are doing, groups like ourselves, but also, folks both in the DoD and the State Department and researchers around the world looking for Russian disinformation, they tended to lose a lot of those accounts. And oftentimes they would be suspended pretty quickly. So we're seeing them do two things. They're using a lot more bot activity. They've got a campaign called Doppelganger that I think would really be worth the time for any of your members to look up and read a little bit about. But they're also using real influencers, both real people that are either paid to post pro-Russian content, or they have a particular affinity for Russia. So, there's a number of people like influencers that work for RT, for instance, have a large following on social media, and they will use that following to disseminate disinformation, often using very specific narratives that have been laundered in a variety of ways. We've recently identified a campaign that used fake news pages that would take these narratives and use these fake news pages to plant them into Western conversations. So, long answer to a complex question, but what we're seeing in the future looks entirely different from what we've seen in the past. The only real similarity is that it's still relying on the same basic human psychology.
And that basic human psychology is what? Do you have it?
Is that people will believe what they were already inclined to believe, and if you give them something that they want to believe, they will spread it for you.
Yes, precisely. You appeal to things that they already agree with, and then you get a lot for free. Definitely the case. You were mentioning the taking of other stories and replanting them, so to speak. Is that what I was reading on the Clemson website there about DC Weekly? That's something I didn't know anything about. That's an interesting story.
Yeah, that's a website we identified in the fall that was created by the Russians to look like a legitimate, DC area news website. It used AI to steal content from other news pages and rewrite that content and populate the website with a constant stream of new, legitimate-looking news. And so once they had that framework and that legitimacy established, they took stories that were created from whole cloth. So, for instance, just a story that started on YouTube from a video that the Russians would create of, say, someone with a story to tell, someone with an insider's perspective about especially what was going on in Ukraine. And they would use DC Weekly to disseminate those stories among Western audiences.
Mekela.
Oh, I would love to ask Darren a question if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So, you talked about some of the differences you expect in this election cycle. I'm wondering to what extent you have looked at the persuasive effect of Russian disinformation and whether you expect, without necessarily being able to measure concretely, you expect that persuasion effect to potentially change in this election cycle and beyond?
So, effect is always really hard to understand when you're looking at Russian disinformation, because, they are affecting the entire ecosystem, and it's hard to pull out the pieces and really try to look at the effect of any one thing. And it's also true that the Russian disinformation machine isn't just one thing. You have Russian state media, you have Russian embassy websites and social media accounts. You have Russian bots, you have Russian influencers, and they all may be working together to spread a single narrative at any given moment. So it's really hard to try to pick it apart and understand the persuasive effect of any one thing. That said, we have been trying to understand, especially how these fake news pages, for instance, are working. Just as in years past, we really tried to understand the persuasive effect of the social media accounts individually. So, for instance, our next project that we're looking at related to these news pages is trying to understand the effect of how the Russians go about their layering of disinformation. By that, I mean taking a story and sort of separating it from its original Russian source. So with these narratives that were spread by DC Weekly, they would start, for instance, with just a YouTube story, just a single, video planted on a brand new account that didn't exist 5 days ago. But they would take that story and write a story, that narrative, and write a story about it and plant that narrative in a non-Western news source, very often in West Africa or the Arab-speaking world. And then they would take that story and write another story about it and plant it in DC Weekly. And then they would take the DC Weekly story and plant it with some of their social media influencers. Each step in the chain, removing it farther and farther away from, the original Russian source. And we're looking at, what is the cumulative effect of each of these steps in the chain in making the story more believable each time.
I think the general assumption has been that from 2016 and 2020 and 2016, 18, 20, and 22, the Russians were primarily focusing on just being chaos agents. I mean, they're what they wanted to do is just throw grenades into the American political system, get us hating each other, and so forth. Is that still their kind of overall overarching approach to life, or have you noticed that they have more specific political
they are right now very focused on the war in Ukraine.
That makes sense.
Yeah, for obvious reasons. It's an existential threat for them, and so their entire disinformation apparatus is very focused on the war in Ukraine. So we started following this campaign of narrative laundering back in the fall, and we've identified 36 individual narratives. Some of them, it's like throwing spaghetti on the wall and only a little bit of it sticks. So some of these narratives never really went anywhere. Some of them spread very, very broadly. So stories like, Zelensky owning 2 yachts worth $75 million. That was a story told by members of Congress.
So it did get some traction then.
Yeah, right. Or the story about Tucker Carlson going to Russia, and there was an assassination attempt on his life, that the Ukrainians tried to assassinate Tucker Carlson. Widely distributed in especially right-leaning news sources in the West, completely made up whole cloth by this same campaign. So a lot of these stories are very focused on undermining the legitimacy of the President Zelensky and support for the war in Ukraine from the West. Just recently, we've started to see stories that are similarly attacking Biden. They had one story that was suggesting that the Ukrainians were running a troll farm in Ukraine in order to support Joe Biden's presidency, for instance. But I think at the end of the day, that is also about Ukraine, because I think any neutral arbiter is going to look at these two candidates, Trump and Biden, and know that one of them is going to be better for Ukraine than the other.
Clearly. Yeah, and yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. So even though the focus right now in Russian fake news and disinformation is on Ukraine or more Russian-oriented topics, the spinoff certainly does affect the American election.
Sure.
Because
at the end of the day, though, I think I want to point out that for Putin, who's ultimately behind all of it, the end user is always the Russian people. Even I think to an extent when he's trying to influence conversations in the West, it's to try to make his own position look better vis-a-vis the Russian people, because without the Russian people, he has nothing.
Well, yeah, that's speaking of modus operandi, modi operandi with their world. Yeah. What about China? China, you said, uses different techniques than Russia.
Yeah, so China typically tries to, and there's always exceptions. And in fact, we're starting to slowly see them, toy with other tactics. But an overgeneralization would be to say that Russia promotes ideas and China demotes ideas. Russia wants you talking about your neighbor. China doesn't want you talking about certain things about China at all. So they do this in a couple of very specific ways. 2 quick examples is they will attack individuals, especially members of the Chinese diaspora, who are critical, especially of Xi or China more broadly, and they will go online and harass these individuals, and not just online, also offline. They'll call them or send them mail or knock on their door oftentimes. But they'll harass these individuals with just horrible, nasty threats, sometimes threats of violence. And but they'll suppress them in other ways as well that are a little more tricky. Like, for instance, creating dozens of fake versions of an individual's social media account. So if you try to engage with that individual on social media, you don't know if you're engaging with a real person or somebody that's actually a Chinese troll account. And in this way, they just, swamp out the voice of these dissidents. Very often dissidents that are right here in the United States, very often U.S. citizens of Chinese descent or U.S. residents. But another thing that they'll do that's very similar is that if there's an idea they don't like, sometimes an idea might be encapsulated by a hashtag. They'll similarly swamp out that hashtag by flooding it, by hijacking that hashtag and putting out thousands of posts with that hashtag that have meaningless content or content related to something that China wants you to see. So, for instance, a very easy example of that to understand was in the run-up to the Beijing Olympics a few years ago. Activists were starting to use hashtag genocide games. They were using this hashtag to connect conversations about Xinjiang and the atrocities perpetrated on the Uyghur minority there with conversations about the Beijing Olympics. And it's a great hashtag. It had alliteration. It was a great vehicle to have these conversations. And obviously, this was not a hashtag that China wanted anybody using. They were very focused at that time on the Beijing Olympics being a success and nobody talking about the Uyghur. And so as soon as that hashtag started to become just a little bit popular, you saw thousands of accounts using it, just attaching genocide games to, videos of happy Uyghur dancing in the streets in Xinjiang or video stories about Uyghur culture.
Your grocery list.
That it was intended to use.
Yeah. No, that's I learned actually from your website about hashtag flooding. I had never heard of that before, but I can see how that would be a really effective technique. Because if you want to know about the problems with the Uyghurs and what the Chinese government is doing, you're not going to be able to find it amidst all the junk that is surrounding.
And I think that both of these different sort of ways of engaging in disinformation are rooted in what both of these countries have done historically. So if you look at Russia, the long history of active measures going back to the age of the KGB and even before, of planting stories, of fire hose of falsehood, disinformation campaigns. Famously in the 80s, they planted a story that in a Indian newspaper that they made, that they created the newspaper, that the CIA was responsible for the AIDS virus, that they created it in a lab. And then they took that story, they planted it and disseminated it in other ways. So, they have a history of doing exactly the sort of thing that we're seeing them do now, but just with, new technology. And China's the same way. China has a history of suppressing stories internally that they don't want to talk about. I mean, look what they've done with Tiananmen Square, for instance.
It's very hard to find anything on that.
Exactly, especially if you're in China. And so they take that same approach and try to apply it to the entire internet.
Well, I think you've made a very interesting point that I hadn't thought about, but you made it very explicit, and it makes a lot of sense to me that when we look at foreign actors that are trying to influence American politics, we understand them better by understanding what their national goals are, because whatever they're doing is going to be promoting those national goals.
It's not
in the
about
case of the Russians, or it's not necessarily about us. We certainly have plenty of homegrown efforts to spread misinformation, though. Even if Russia and any other mischief makers were just to disappear, we'd still have plenty of examples. I know, Mekela, the Brennan Center has expressed a lot of concern about the targeting of people who run elections in states and communities. I know there have been some really quite dreadful things occurring to these people, but given what happened in 2020 and 2022, what might we anticipate in this election year?
Yeah, so one thing I will say, which is a little bit, different from from what Darren was saying, I think a lot of the mis and disinformation he focuses on is probably not specific to the U.S. election process. So to the extent that Russians are sort of spreading disinformation. In the US, it's often sort of to do with candidates. Sometimes it does touch on the elections process. But, I'm curious to hear your reaction to what I'm going to say as well, which is that, one of the things that we have found in our research is that the same false election narratives in the US tend to crop up repeatedly, which is fairly consonant with some of the other research from disinformation scholars. So, for example, in the lead up to the midterm elections in 2022, we did tracking of election misinformation narratives on major social media platforms. We had a team of analysts that read through thousands of social media posts, and we conducted an automated analysis of tens of thousands of posts. And we found that a large share of false election information that we analyzed did reflect themes that were the same or similar to those in the 2020 election. These included core conspiracies about voting machines, mail voting and drop boxes, baseless accusations of widespread votes cast by non-citizens, and so on. And that has been true in prior election cycles as well. And so when innocent glitches occur in election administration, and these do occur in most federal elections, they're typically quickly resolved. Falsehoods about those glitches are often filtered through these core false narratives as they spread and metastasize on social media. Because people are familiar with these narratives and they resonate, they're sort of sticky, so to speak. It's easy for election deniers to take sort of a new circumstance and kind of filter it through this core narrative. And these are also the incidents that tend to really resonate with people, where there's a small glitch with voting machines that's quickly resolved. That really tends to take on a life of its own on social media. So, what we say is that many folks who spread falsehoods about the elections process don't necessarily reinvent the wheel. And we know that there have been, a lot of the focus when it comes to the role of AI and disinformation has very much been on visual deepfakes, so deepfakes of candidates and other political actors in the process. But there has been less sort of investigation and focus on the possible role of large language models in producing mis and disinformation. And one thing we unfortunately do know is that generative AI platforms already have access to plenty of variations of these core false election narratives in their training data, which suggests that they could be a particularly powerful tool for producing falsehoods about elections that could, even be true when faced with real-time unfolding news events and elections. Because, as I mentioned, these events can be filtered through these core false narratives. You also have the possibility of the use of deepfakes to misrepresent election officials, to falsely portray them as engaging in wrongful conduct in elections, which is done in other ways or has been done in other ways previously. But I think sort of, at least when it comes to mis and disinformation in elections, we expect to some extent, at least, there will be more of the same. And even though that is troubling, it is heartening in some ways as well, because, local election officials and civil society organizations and others who are engaged in the process of helping voters and addressing mis and disinformation can certainly do preparatory work to prepare to respond to those very common false election narratives as they arise.
Actually, I was going to ask you, basically, what do we do about this kind of misinformation and fake news and disinformation? How can we cope with this ongoing flood that we've had in the past and that we certainly can anticipate in the future? I want to think about this on two levels, just as an organizational thing that they run together, certainly. How do we cope with information on the individual level? How does an individual get better skills and become less vulnerable to these kinds of attacks that we've been talking about? And then secondly, if time permitting, dealing with information on the institutional level. What can local, state, or national institutions do to deter this kind of these shenanigans? And what can the media do? All media, but particularly the social media platforms. And I know you all have opinions on that. But let's talk about this individual level first. And one individual level approach, of course, is debunking, which skeptics are very familiar with. You'll see a lot of, if you could see our audience, you'd see a lot of people saying, yes, that's what we do. We get out there and we debunk things. We correct extant misinformation. Someone is wrong on the internet. Where have we heard that before? Skeptics tend to be particularly interested in debunking claims about science and debunking conspiracies. There also are professional organizations that fact check. We're all familiar with them. Snopes or Annenberg's fact checked. Washington Post has them. There's a lot of institutions and organizations out there that are, debunking in the sense of fact checking. I think skeptics may think primarily about debunking when it comes to coping with misinformation, but there's a lot more to debunking than that. There's also pre-bunking, which is the idea of inoculating people against misinformation. And it appears to be used to inoculate against factual misinformation, which is sort of the thing that skeptics are really interested in, but also methods of manipulation and persuasion. And this has been something that Sander has spent a great deal of time and effort and has some very good experiences with that. If you can just tell us a little bit about pre-bunking, how does it work, and what is it used for? How can we do stuff with it? Tell us about pre-bunking.
Sure, yeah. So, pre-bunking, we came up with that term because it helps people understand that it's the opposite of debunking. With debunking, everyone's familiar with debunking, where you come in after the facts and you try to, quote unquote, cure people from their misconceptions. But we know that that's an uphill sort of battle. And that's also where the medical analogy is relevant. If somebody is already, quote unquote, infected with a disease, it's much more difficult to help someone and cure them than it is to actually prevent the disease from forming in the first place. And on a psychological level, that rings true too. Once people are exposed to misinformation, especially if it resonates with their identities, they integrate it into their mental model of how the world works, people become committed. It's actually really difficult to try to then come in, particularly if you're a stranger and you don't have a trust relationship with someone, to try to undo that. And so for all of those reasons, and this is often called the continued influence of misinformation. In fact, I'm not saying, by the way, that debunking is not important. I think debunking is super important, and we should all do it. It's just that even when you debunk stuff, we know that people continue to rely on the falsehoods because they replicate. Think of memory as a network. So falsehoods tend to cling on to lots of other things that or think are true. It kind of builds into lots of connections that you have in your memory networks of how something works. Think about vaccines, for example. So people have lots of associations with vaccines, side effects, safety, live vaccines, inactive vaccines. And misinformation can sort of make its way through all of those concepts. And then when you try to debunk something, you can debunk some links, but others will remain intact. And so you're at a disadvantage in a way because you have to play this game of whack-a-mole. And it's important to do that, but it would be more advantageous if we actually were able to control the framing of it, right? So if you're debunking, you're already in a losing frame in the sense that now you're forced to repeat falsehoods that other people have been spreading, because how are you going to correct it without repeating it? And you have to respond to somebody who's already usually been disingenuous in some way, right? So pre-bunking actually allows you to come in beforehand and prepare people for a future, attack on their beliefs about the world, about science, about elections. And pre-bunking can be lots of things now. So people use the term pre-bunking for for anything that comes before in terms of time. So if you can do anything before people are exposed to misinformation, and technically that's pre-bunking. But this concept is being watered down a little bit as it's being scaled by different organizations and governments and social media companies. So the way that we like to think about pre-bunking is through this concept of psychological inoculation, which is an evidence sort of based approach. And it really just follows the vaccine analogy. So what is psychological inoculation? Just as you expose people to a weakened or inactivated strain of a virus to try to trigger the production of antibodies to help confer resistance against future infection, turns out you can do the same with information, right? By preemptively exposing people, not to the facts necessarily, but to a weakened dose of disinformation or the types of tactics that are used to spread disinformation, by refuting and deconstructing that in advance, by revealing the magician's trick, so to speak, people can build up cognitive or mental immunity and become more resistant to it in the future. And you can measure these cognitive antibodies too by the amount of counter arguments people can conjure, by their ability to identify misleading techniques, by their resistance to being persuaded in the future via misinformation. And so there's a lot to say about that analogy and how it works. Pre-bunking, just to use that term, the concept of inoculation actually goes back to the 60s, to a psychologist who had, I think, one crucial fundamental insight that's useful, which was that when the U.S. government was panicking about, during the Korean War, about their soldiers being brainwashed by foreign troops, there's a lot of misunderstanding about that war anyway. But just going off of what they thought was true in the 60s, one of the things that they were concerned about is that U.S. soldiers were going to get brainwashed by foreign troops, and so they wanted to find a way to have them resist these interrogation sort of techniques. And the U.S. government was sort of pressing this idea that that we need to give them all the pamphlets with the facts about how great America is, and you need to know all the good things about America so that you're not swayed by all these other ideologies that people might try to sell you. And this psychologist called Bill McGuire said, actually, I think that's not necessarily the case. I think what people need is a simulation of the types of attacks that they might be facing, and rehearse that with people in advance in weakened form so that they build up resistance when it actually happens to them. And that's much more specific. You can give people all the facts in the world, but in a live situation, people are often not accessing the right things unless you rehearse it with them in advance through a one-on-one type of simulation. And so that's how you make people resilient. And that's often what's lacking in media literacy and education. And it's great to give people sort of general critical thinking skills, but if you don't show them what the attacks are going to look like, on them in specific weakened form, it's very hard for people to experientially build up this sort of resistance. So that's what inoculation is all about. That's what we tried to do with the government during the previous elections with social media companies, and happy to talk more about that later, perhaps. But that's sort of the core idea behind it.
Yeah, I know that both your group and Sanders, I'm sorry, both Darren's group and Sanders have produced materials that attempt to do this, to expose people to the bad stuff, but do it in a way that makes them realize that that's not the position that they should be having. That your spot the troll game, for example, is a lot of fun, Darren. And just for listeners, you should also check out the Truth Labs for Education. This is a consortium of Cambridge, Bristol, and Google Jigsaw. And they have a whole series of videos about how to recognize ad hominem language, ad hominem reasoning, emotional language, false dichotomies, and things like that. Those I think are efforts to make pre-bunking very palatable. Do you guys want to comment any more about these materials, or?
I would point out that the troll quiz, while I love it and I'm proud of it, it's right now it's pretty outdated. It desperately needs a refresh. We were hoping to do that before November, but it's also surprisingly expensive to build a website. So we're looking for someone with a spare $55,000.
That's a great thing about games, though. That one of the things I love about doing games is that you can actually update them. So the videos we've done are great because you can scale them on social media, right? But you can't just redo a video. It's scripted, it's animated. When it's done, it's done. With a game, you can actually continuously stay ahead of future disinformation. And that's, it does cost money, as Darren was saying. It's expensive to make and host these things. So that's the downside. And of course, you need to get people to play these things. That's the other part. Videos on YouTube, YouTube could make them non-skippable. So they can reach, hundreds of millions of voters all at the same time. It's hard to force people to play the game. But if you make it fun and entertaining, like, Spot the Troll, then maybe you don't have to.
But it's some money for some Facebook ads. Doesn't hurt either.
Yeah.
There you go. Another individual technique, in addition to nobody ever talks about bunking. We have debunking and pre-bunking, but nobody talks about bunking, and maybe there's a reason for that. But another individual technique is nudging. And Sandra, you might be a good person to talk about nudging. I don't know, maybe Darren and Mekela also know about nudging, but I know you've worked with a number of people who have conducted nudging types of experiments. So tell us about nudging and how that can help.
Nudging, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm the best person. There's oddly enough, in this, I think the more tools we have, the better. But as in any field, there's some back and forth about the pros and cons of different interventions, and we were tasked
feel
with doing
free to criticize. Feel free to criticize.
But I don't want to be too. I think See, the thing is with this, other people do that. I think the thing for me with this topic is actually the more the better, and it's really not always worth it to criticize minor things in order to distract from the larger effort. But maybe I'll just explain the pros and cons of different approaches. And so,
well, you better
the
tell
idea behind the
tell people what nudging is, first of all, because I think a lot of people
what nudging. Yeah, so the original sort of nudging concept, right, is based not necessarily on improving people's skills or knowledge, right? So, so the big thing about nudging was like, well, we waste all of this time trying to teach people things, and why don't we just change the environment in which people make a decision so that we nudge them kind of unconsciously towards the better decision, right? And the classical example is rearrange your fridge to put the naughty stuff further back, then you're less likely to go for the ice cream. And so who would argue against that? Now it turns out lots of people, but the idea was kind of people it's paternalistic, telling me what to do, evil government telling me not to eat ice cream, and so that's kind of the idea behind nudging. And then they took this into the misinfo space, and the core thing behind nudging is when you're on social media, you'll get like a little prompt or nudge that says, would you consider the accuracy of a particular headline? Anything. Can you rate this of how accurate you find this from 1 to 7? And then afterwards, they sort of look at the types of posts that people share, and they find that people share less misinformation or become more discerning in the types of content that they share for at least a little while. And the mechanism for that is that you put people in the mindset of accuracy. So when you prompt or prime people with the concept of accuracy, just by asking them to rate a headline in terms of its accuracy, people are temporarily in the mindset of accuracy, and they become a bit more discerning. Of course, there's distractions in our environment, so the critique that you then often get is, well, that goes away pretty fast. But it's sort of it's a useful tool for social media companies, perhaps when you're on social media and you can prompt people and say, hey, do you want to think about accuracy a little bit? And if that helps people, temporarily share less misinfo, then I think that could be a useful tool in the toolbox. The typical critiques that you get is like, okay, it's short-lived because people become annoyed if you nudge them too much. It's not transparent, so people don't know that they're being nudged. And some of the other critiques are that there's partisan asymmetries. So, and you see this with lifestyle nudges as well. Democrats tend to like being nudged. Republicans don't like being nudged so much. And so that is a difference in the. I think they're expressing a difference in the role of government in society, because it is a paternalistic sort of approach, right? That usually some institution like a social media company or government is sort of nudging people to make healthier choices. And if you have a very libertarian or right-leaning worldview, then you're all about freedom of choice and people not interfering with your business. And so you do see that the effectiveness of the nudge can sometimes depend on people's ideology. And so then the argument goes, well, if most of the elites who are spreading all the misinformation are not responding to the nudge, right, then are you reducing system level misinformation effectively? But I think you could say that about lots of interventions, right? Each have their strengths and weaknesses. And I think in order to reduce system level misinformation, we need all of them. So for inoculation, and this is the last thing I'll say, for example, is they could turn it around and say, okay, but inoculation does teach people a skill, right? It does confer knowledge or ability of people to then actually apply, some of the things that they've been inoculated against. But it requires that people opt into this process of being, wanting. The nudge doesn't require anything. People just, read the headline. So yes, it requires a heavier upfront cost of people buying into this type of intervention or being forced to sit through it. And the other thing might be that you were talking about some of these techniques, right? So inoculation can be extremely specific, like a weakened dose out of the exact virus. So Twitter did this in the previous election, long before Musk. They had a pre-bunking team, and one of the things they did was they tried to pre-bunk the vote, that voting by mail is unsafe. So that's a very what we call narrow spectrum inoculation. So they send a message to the top of the feed of most U.S. Twitter users and said, look, you're going to be seeing misinformation on Twitter. That's what we call the forewarning element of inoculation. People have to be prepared for incoming deception. And then they said, some people will say that voting by mail is not safe and give some examples. But however, you should know that all election experts basically agree that it's safe. Here are some authoritative sources and so on. So people were prepared in advance for this type of election misinformation. And that's a specific pre-bunk. But you can also then go, okay, well, but now you've inoculated against voting by mail, but what if they come up with some other myth and another myth and another myth? And so the solution to that has been to sort of scale inoculation to the level of the technique, things like emotional manipulation, polarizing people, trolling people, ad hominem attacks, false dichotomies, things politicians love to use, whether the content is completely fake or not, and do it at the technique level. And so then though, so if you do that, so let's say, Jeannie, if I inoculate you against emotional manipulation in headlines, you could get the critique that I can show you how to do that, but then I haven't persuaded you of any specific facts. So even now, that you're encountering emotional manipulation. I haven't changed, who you're going to vote for, or I can't guarantee that now you're going to rely less on a particular piece of misinformation. And that's probably true because you have to make some trade-off between, making things nonpartisan and palatable for people. That okay, no matter where it's coming from, we want to help people identify emotional manipulation and make sure that everyone in an election is able to sort of identify that. Or we want to pre-bunk very specific myths for very specific groups of people. So there's a trade-off in the specificity of the inoculation process. One you can scale very broadly, right? And it doesn't require any specific polarizing type of content that might put people off. So, for example, in the videos we use, for false dichotomy, we use a clip from Star Wars, Revenge of the Sith, where you have Anakin Skywalker talk to Obi-Wan, who says, either you're with me or you're my enemy. That's a false dichotomy, right? Either you vote for me or, you don't care about these issues. And so that's the general sort of inoculation. And then the weekend dose is the Star Wars clip, and that's not polarizing. But people say, okay, but that's Star Wars. Is this going to work for election content, right? And that's you got to hope that people then apply it. You can't get specific, right? And pre-bunk a specific example about Ukraine, for example, or immigration or abortion or climate change. It's just that it's a little trickier because some people might not like the content or the topic, and so you have to find a way to disarm people so that they're open to sort of learning about these things.
It's harder.
Go ahead.
It's also harder. I was thinking of some of the things that Darren was talking about, because it sounds like they're not, like just using the Russians as an example, they're not really using the ad hominem attacks, especially. They're not really using the inflammatory headlines that you could be inoculated against. They're just sort of straight up news stories that look just real. I mean, Zelensky here has got this new yacht that he's that he's parking over in France or wherever he was supposedly parking. I mean, it's just there's just a ton of misinformation out there and a ton of fake news. And some of it I think can be inoculated against, and some of it, I mean, y'all don't know me, but I suffer from pathological optimism, but I'm not very optimistic about this kind of thing. Sometimes I despair because it seems like there's so much out there that it just requires knowledge to refute. But I think that's what we'll get into it perhaps in more detail shortly. Just to sort of,
I can't get over the fact that Sanders suggested that Revenge of the Sith isn't polarizing. But I think you're making.
I guess that's fair enough.
Otherwise, brilliant.
Well, we're talking about individual level approaches to coping with fake news and disinformation. And just to sort of round it out, in addition to debunking and pre-bunking and nudging, there's also the field of media literacy, which tends to be basically just teaching individuals to be better consumers of media. And this is often done in formal education settings. You provide teachers materials that they can use to teach students how to be critical consumers. It doesn't seem like a lot of this is going on among adults, which, before I retired, I was head of a science education nonprofit that does not make me an expert in science education. Trust me on that. But I was aware of a lot of efforts to try to increase critical thinking and media literacy in the K-12 curriculum, especially middle school to high school. I didn't get the feeling that it was as widespread as it might need to be, and I didn't get the feeling that it wasn't especially working a whole lot, but it's still fairly new in terms of K-12 public education. But and again, it doesn't seem like adults are getting much of this, that there's not much effort being made to kind of improve the media literacy of adults. But I don't know. This isn't my field. Do you guys have any reflection on that? Is media literacy something that's happening in any important fashion?
No. The answer is no.
The answer is you don't know, or it isn't.
No, it isn't. I think there's certainly at the K-12 level, there's no taste for it, as mis and disinformation has become a more political lightning rod. I worked on a project recently where we purposefully steered it away from teaching anything to K-12 because we knew it wouldn't get funding. and older adults, it's always difficult to teach older adults anything.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. I think in Europe, I think there's some good things being done. Like, I mean, if you look at what, the kind of work they do in Finland, for instance, where, fighting disinformation is a real whole of society project in a way that it just isn't here.
I would also add that one kind of complicating factor is that people who really strongly believe in conspiracy theories tend to think of themselves as critical thinkers. So they are pretty good at finding, the information that they want to find. And so my hypothesis would be that literacy efforts are going to be most effective on people who are inadvertently encountering misinformation, rather than sort of the hardcore conspiracy theorists.
I couldn't agree more with Mekela. I mean, look at, for instance, the QAnon community. Think what you will of the QAnon community. They were doing a lot of critical thinking. It was just terribly misguided.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I think as Darren said, there's a lot of stuff happening outside of the United States in terms of media literacy. There's research on, Sam Weinberg at Stanford does a lot of lateral reading stuff with students, right? There's research, how do you open up another tab? And it's funny because my collaborators often tell me that it's hard to get students to open up another tab on their laptop and pay attention. And it's surprisingly, you think that'd be an easy intervention, but actually it's hard to get them to do these things, to figure out sources. And so I think, people are researching it, but there's, as Darren said, there's no appetite for it. And I think, your earlier question about what's going on this election, not to get too political, but there are unprecedented attacks on scientists and people who study topics like mis and disinformation. I mean, there's the Jim Jordan's congressional subcommittee, right? Stanford's, I'm not sure if you saw the Stanford Stop Disinformation Center collapse under political pressure. The Harvard Shorenstein program was folded, closed its doors last year for different reasons. A lot of misinformation researchers are being sued, FOI'd, subpoenaed. In fact, there was a Nature article on this that actually showed it's not just the US. In many countries, there's political interference in academia. And one of the hallmarks of rising fascism and authoritarianism is declaring scientists as enemies of the state, and trying to dismantle, public intellectualism in some way. And so I think that is a very concerning trend, because it cripples the ability to do something about misinformation, because it becomes a hot potato. It's too political. Social media companies it gives them a free pass not to do anything, to dial back measures. So I think one of the biggest threats is actually, the calls coming from inside the house, so to speak, as well as all the foreign disinformation. In fact, the Global Engagement Center, which I'm sure Darren does work with, who are the U.S. State Department's main task force for identifying foreign propaganda, are I think they're going to close down by the end of the year, also due to political pressure.
Wow.
So I think that is a major problematic development in my view as an outsider here from the other side of the pond.
Yeah, believe me, you should stay at Cambridge. I've spent a lot of time dealing with this issue. Jim Jordan's office has a lot of my emails to go through. But I think that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of good work we can still do and accomplish, even across partisan divides. Some of it is about reframing the nature of the problem. It's not just about politics. It's not just about, disinformation about Republicans or Democrats. A lot of these same tools and techniques are used to engage in fraud. And not just Americans, around the globe, we're losing billions of dollars to fraud, especially older adults who vote are losing billions of dollars to fraud. And it's the same tools and techniques that bad actors use to engage in fraud that they use to engage in disinformation. We've just finished, or close to finishing, I shouldn't say finished, we're close to finishing an NSF-funded project that our team here at Clemson worked on with a collaboration from a number of institutions, including Illinois and SUNY Buffalo, building a suite of modules to teach older adults to be more resilient to fraud. And, sort of indirectly, a lot of the lessons that we're teaching them get at fighting mis and disinformation as well.
Yeah,
that's actually an interesting comment, Darren. Sorry, Eugenie, you go.
No.
But no, I have a colleague in accounting. His name's Alan, and a few years ago he approached me because he said, he's in accounting, but he specializes in fraud. And he says, actually, it's the same techniques that are used in fraud as in disinformation. And he's been trying to reframe the whole disinfo debate because he said, we already have all the legislation. We went through this in the fraud industry, and people have accepted standards and investigations and interventions as normal when it comes to fraud detection. But somehow when it comes to disinformation, it's polarizing, but it's the same problem. So that's really interesting that you mentioned that, because I hadn't thought about that, in fact, and so that was an interesting pivot point for me as well. But yeah, all this to say it. Yeah, go ahead.
Similarly, the language that we use to talk about narrative laundering, which is something the Russians do a lot of, we take the language we use to talk about that from the way they talk about money laundering, where you have placement and layering and integration, because it's fundamentally the same processes at work.
I'll say that for all of these reasons, it's more important now than ever that the skeptics come out and support science, and I think that's really part of the struggle here. It's that public opinion polls show that people want scientists to engage more and translate and be more involved in the policy process. I mean, there's some partisan divisions over that, but mostly it seems that that's what the public wants. And so I think skeptics have always been kind of the voice of reason. So especially when science is under attack, I think having a unified front is all the more important.
I would certainly agree. We have another consideration here. We've been talking about individual level approaches, pre-bunking, debunking, nudging, critical thinking, or media literacy types of things. But there's also, I think it's also worth talking about an institutional level approach to this problem. Is there a role for local or state governments in reducing the spread or acceptance of misinformation? Mekela, you were talking about work on local election boards. Is there anything that they can do to try to ensure that their ability to do their work is not affected by these kinds of efforts?
Yes, absolutely. I think particularly where election mis and disinformation could affect the right to vote and could deter people from exercising their right to vote, it's really critical that election officials step in and, even though they are incredibly under-resourced, there are relatively straightforward steps and resources sort of available, from the federal government as well to help them do this. But, a few that spring to mind include having crisis communication plans. Again, knowing that some of these core election narratives tend to recur over and over again when, an incident occurs in an election, having a pre-prepared plan that they can tailor to the circumstance is very helpful. making sure that they have contacts in hard to reach groups, as well as establishing networks with candidates of all affiliations, with ethnic news media, with civil society organizations who are active in their communities, making sure that they can get that information out straight away after a misinformation narrative takes root that affects their jurisdiction in particular, and then putting out some of this information ahead of time about the security of the election process. We have found with polling that there are some messages that are potentially more effective about the sort of checks in place already around election security and the election process, and putting some of that information out there to at least have the foundation in place so that if people are receptive to it, they can have more confidence about the election process.
I remember hearing a program, an interview at probably NPR or something. This was a couple of years ago, where they were interviewing a woman who had just been elected to their local elections board. I forget exactly what it was called, but her job, the panel was to oversee the local paid staff who really administered the local elections. And she had gotten elected on a platform of, we've got to stop the steal kind of thing, that, the assumption that the local elections board was engaging in behaviors that would tilt the results to one candidate or another. And, she was just going to go after them, and she got elected. And then she actually sat down and talked with the people who were in charge, who walked her through the procedure. Okay, this is what we do. We set up things this way. We set up things so that when a person votes, there is this kind of security regarding that person's paper or whatever it is, electronic. We have these safeguards in place. And, she got elected on this on this platform that these guys were a bunch of bums who were affecting the future of their community and so forth. But you could just tell it was a good reporter, as the reporter was interviewing her, she couldn't exactly admit it, but she clearly was having second thoughts. Now that she actually knew that there were safeguards in place, that she actually knew that people were following some very stringent rules, which is the case with a lot of these local election procedures. I mean, they just don't make it up as they go along. I mean, they really have to check a lot of boxes to get this job done. But she was clearly, reconsidering her priors, as we'd say in the Bayesian world. And it was very interesting to listen to that. And you just kind of wonder, again, this is my pathological optimism coming in, not my more recent depression, but more people who find out about those kinds of procedures and the safeguards that do exist, and the fact that voting boxes aren't manipulable like people think they are. I mean, the collection boxes. The better off I think we're going to be. I think we'll have less of this. So your point about getting this information out ahead of time, I think would be very conducive to helping to head off these problems.
Well, your observation is interesting because, one of the strategies that prominent election deniers are using now is encouraging activists to get involved in the process of election administration to gain controls of the levers of election administration. But, I am aware of at least one instance where, somebody who was inclined to believe election denial narratives participated as a poll worker and had their mind changed by the participating in the process, which is, not necessarily sort of a grand commentary on what's happening, but, it's just an interesting anecdote.
I know of a very similar case here in South Carolina that I heard of firsthand, where the person went through the training, and at the end of the training, they said, "Oh, well, you know what? Our procedures here in South Carolina are great. We're doing everything well. It's those other states that I'm worried about." I want to point out something that Mekela said a couple of times that I think is really important, and that is just how predictable a lot of mis and disinformation can be. You know, we know what these narratives are before they happen. I remember during the pandemic, I was curious as to who was the first person on the internet who put the words COVID and 5G in the same sentence. And so I went looking, and it was someone in New Zealand who literally wrote a tweet that said, and 5G is responsible for COVID in 5, 4, 3, 2. That was their tweet. And 12 hours later, somebody in Italy was talking about how 5G started COVID. And we see this with, as Mekela said, we see it with election-related disinformation as well. Interestingly, the Russian trolls in 2016, I think, assumed that Trump was about to lose, and in the week before the election, they put out a lot of content that was undermining the integrity of the election, questioning it, using the same hashtags that we would see later in 2020 with Trump's own campaign using. But in 2016, it was the Russians who thought he was going to lose, but he didn't, using these hashtags, whereas 2020, it was the campaign itself.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar, that what makes for a little bit of optimism is that a lot of these misinformation techniques are repeated and predictable, as Mekela and Darren indicated. Because, you know, you often in this topic, you always get people like, okay, what is misinformation? What makes you the arbiter of truth? But the fact is, like, oh, it's all context dependent. But the fact is, we don't have to have an extensive relativistic debate about the nature of truth, because we know that some of these tactics are repeated year after year, regardless of what the specific context is. I mean, if you look at the history of anti-vax propaganda, what strikes me, I always use this example, people strikes me with, oh, the new mRNA vaccines, you know, new technology is going to change your DNA. But if you look at some of the images that are online from the 1800s, where, you know, Edward Jenner came up with the first vaccine, cowpox against smallpox, you would see paintings with human heads, and then, you know, basically cows sprouting out of people's mouths, like udders coming out of their ears. And the whole idea was that the new vaccine in the 1800s was going to change your body. And so it's the same tactic, just deployed 200 years later. And somehow we fail to sort of anticipate many of these techniques. And because, you know, I think the great thing for inoculation pre-bunking is that it is predicated to some extent on our ability to predict some of these techniques and bank on them recurring. And that's true for, you know, for a lot of election disinformation as well as some of the other topics, you know. And it doesn't always materialize. I mean, Zelensky did a pre-bunk of a Russian deepfake that was going to say that he's surrendering, and then initially the deepfake didn't come, but it did come eventually. And so the idea is that, you know, you can't anticipate what some of these actors are planning. I mean, Taiwan did the same with China. The ministry, the digital minister in Taiwan, she's a former computer scientist, I think, and has celebrated hacker personality, but she's or they, I should say, were great in that they deepfake themselves every year until the election, and then when the deepfake from China came, people were like, well, we know what this is. And so that, you know, that's the commitments to pre-bunking that I'm looking for here. And so that's, you know, that sort of combines the, you know, the robocalls with Biden that could have been rehearsed with the American public in advance. And so it's, you know, it's interesting.
Fun stuff. You know, we've talked a lot about the social media platforms. We've mentioned Facebook and Twitter and of course Google, and they are huge players in this. We've talked a little bit about AI. I'm sure Mekela could tell us a great deal more. But reflecting on the social media platforms themselves, what have they done to reduce the spread of misinformation? And I know this has changed over time. I know that Twitter, Sandra was saying that Twitter used to do better, and they have sort of, you know,
they used to do anything.
Yeah. Is that the case across? I mean, what's going on with social media platforms these days?
A lot less. They're just not putting the resources into moderation or fighting disinformation that they used to. There's the political pressure certainly isn't there anymore. To the extent that anything's done, it's mostly just in English, and that was largely always the case. Meta still has a fairly robust team. They probably do more than anyone, but even they've cut back.
Yeah, I'd say the same. I mean, there, as Darren was saying, a huge problem is they don't invest in non-English fact checking, for example. That's a huge problem. But I think the political pressure has gone on the opposite side. Now that we're actually doing something about misinformation is a problem for them. And so, if they wanted to do something, there's political pressure not to do it. And so that, Musk sort of initiated that, and that had a domino effect on all of the other social media companies. He dialed back, he fired everyone who worked on pre-bunking. He fired the whole trust and safety team. And so other companies were like, maybe we don't need a trust and safety team. If he gets away with it, why should we have a trust and safety team? And so I think it had the opposite effect. I mean, we're making a lot of progress. Twitter they were the first to do large scale pre-bunking. I mean, unprecedented scale. And then, that effort, and they found that it helped restore trust in the electoral process. And then, all of that disappeared. Google Jigsaw, right, the research unit of Google that we've worked with, they do really good work. They're limited in their ability to control what Google does. I mean, Google is an extremely libertarian organization. They freaking out about telling people they put in a wrong search term. So if you search for something and like a data void comes up, so that's something that it doesn't match with, so the string that you're entering doesn't isn't matched against an obvious link. They don't want to tell you you're wrong. I mean, they're freaking out about the idea that they would tell somebody that they're wrong. So let alone do something about misinformation. And so they've played around with pre-bunking, right? Google, the research unit, does do these campaigns. They scale it to hundreds of millions of people. They've shown that it works on their platform, but getting them to commit to making it mandatory, to scaling it to billions, right? They're just not willing to take that final step. And as Darren said, Meta is probably doing the most in a comprehensive way, but they're also scaling back. They're less transparent a bit with their research. They keep it all internal, apart from some collaboration. So we also work a little bit with Meta, but it's harder to be public facing with that work, because there's a lot of internal politics about what they'll do and what they'll not do. And then TikTok is complicated. I mean, it's they have some of the same policies as some of the other companies, but it's unclear exactly what they're doing. And then you have all the platforms that are absolutely doing nothing, like Truth Social and Telegram and similar platforms. So yeah, it's looking pretty bleak at the moment. Coming back to your question about system levels, I think system level stuff is hugely important. We want to reduce system level misinfo. You could say that pre-bunking, debunking, critical thinking, maybe that's just an attempt of evil companies like Google to put the blame on the unsuspecting consumer, while they're letting companies run millions of ads that are really disinformation from the fossil fuel industry or the tobacco industry, and it's all a ruse to distract people from them having to actually do something. Personally, I don't think that's the whole story. I think they're doing what they can at the lower levels. The problem is the upper management, right? And helping people spot misinfo isn't going to lead them to not tweak their algorithms. I think these things are actually fairly disorganized and unrelated. They're kind of like the BBC, where one arm doesn't really know what the other is doing. So I'm a bit skeptical that one undermines the other, but the system level change is really lacking. Maybe Mekela can say more about that, but that's really my perception.
I'll just add a couple of things. Sander mentioned the dismantling of the trust and safety teams. In some cases, that work is being outsourced to sort of private third parties. Is also a problem because it means that folks don't have sort of organization or the ultimate decision-making power. So that is concerning. One area in which things are going in a different direction, I think it's basically the exception to the rule, is generative AI labeling. I think that's an area where there was momentum generally, and companies, major tech companies, are interested in that. Generally, I totally agree that there has been a lot of retrenchment, and it's very troubling. And I do think that companies, as they always have made the calculus that it is they can capitalize now on the changing winds around this issue of addressing mis and disinformation, and that will be in their best interest. But I do wonder if that is true, if the platforms become a very unpleasant place to be on. They may not be as appealing a consumer product for their users.
Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. That is the provision that basically gives platforms a pass, treats them as publishers, so that if you insult somebody or if you commit a libel against someone, the platform doesn't get sued, although you as an individual might be sued. There's a lot of pressure to get rid of that. And there's also pressure to maintain it. Treating the platforms as publishers, yay or nay, is that helpful for combating fake news and disinformation and misinformation? What you guys think a lot about this sort of thing, and that's not my direct field. Do you have any opinions on that?
Thinking a lot doesn't always equate to smart ideas, I would say. Section 230, the cause and solution to all of our problems.
It's the cause and the solution? That's an interesting perspective.
And there's good elements and bad elements.
Well, yeah, I'm certainly not versed in the legal context, so maybe I'll defer back to Mekela on that question.
Well, I would say there are there's a lot of mis and disinformation out there that probably wouldn't give rise to a cause for liability in any case. So, I do think it's a relevant question, but there is a sort of subset of mis and disinformation that would render the purveyor or the publisher to be liable to be sued, and that's from my understanding, a smaller subset of mis and disinformation.
I think there is a long conversation that might be pursued about free speech and whose speech. Are we privileging some speech over others? Certainly, Jim Jordan is very concerned about that. He feels that conservative views are being inhibited from expression on much social media. There are certainly arguments to be made that there doesn't seem to be evidence for that, since the number of conservative Facebook pages and so forth is monumental. It's not, nobody's sitting on these folks especially. But there are some interesting free speech implications of all of this. If the platforms themselves take down sites, take down posts, take down sites, it makes sense if you know that they're Russian bots or Chinese bots or something, because that's kind of that's I don't think anybody's going to argue that they have free speech to throw sand into our gears as a nation. But Sandra, you mentioned the Stanford Internet Research Agency, which has not been completely disassembled, but the founder and the both Stamos and Renee DiResta have been moved elsewhere, shall we say. And if you look at their current website, it seems like they're going to be focusing on education issues and kind of a great deal of what made them a very powerful force in researching the kinds of shenanigans that we've been talking about. That doesn't look like that's going to continue. I suspect that Jim Jordan and Renee DiResta would have very different views of what free speech means. And in some respects, one person's free speech is another person's personal attack, or inhibiting one set of attacks is another person's inhibition of their free speech. I don't think this is a topic that we can solve in the skeptical panel here, but I just wanted to bring it up for our listeners, because I don't think anybody on this panel has ever said that any of these issues are black and white. But I think it's important to recognize the fact that there are nuances in all of this kind of stuff. But I think we're going to have to wrap it up. Obviously, there's much more that could be said about any of the topics that we talked about today. And I would encourage the people watching this panel to consult the websites and the publications of our panelists, because they are extremely enlightening. I, confessed to all of them when I was asking them to serve on this panel that I can hum a few bars when it comes to disinformation. My particular field when I was working was the creation and evolution controversy, and there's a lot of misinformation and mistaken information and stuff that goes on there. So I can hum a few bars, but I am not a researcher in this area. I really want to thank our panelists for having spent time with us and done a wonderful job in helping us all understand these very important issues much more fully than I think any of us understood them when we started this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, do you have any final comments for our viewers? Is something that you would suggest that they keep in mind in going forward in dealing with this issue and recognizing what's going on?
Pray for us all in October.
Can't help, can't hurt, might help. Any other comments?
Seek out information about the election process from authoritative sources such as local election officials, state election officials, vote.gov, and that's particularly true when it comes to information about the election process.
Good advice. Sander, from across the pond,
yeah,
any advice for us?
I think the last thing you said about free speech is actually a pernicious issue. So as we debate people, I think it's important to keep in mind that things like pre-bunking and inoculation are empowering free speech to be free from manipulation, because we don't have a right to manipulate other people with false information, right? Labeling is not taking things down. Nobody's removing any content if you label something. Educating people is not censoring. So I think we, keeping in mind that this moving of the goalpost of what censoring is and what free speech is and what its exceptions are, would be good to try to arm ourselves as we engage with people about election materials, to know what our rights are in terms of free speech and what is manipulation and misinformation.
I think those are excellent words for us to end on. Thank you very much for participating in Skeptical this year, and viewers, again, check their publications. You'll learn a lot. Goodbye.